August 4th, 1945, Camp Papago Park, Arizona. The dust hung thick in the afternoon heat, turning the sun into a copper disk that burned without mercy. Katharina Weber stood perfectly still as two American soldiers approached her three children: 7-year-old Hans, 5-year-old Greta, 3-year-old Emil burning with fever in her arms. The soldiers spoke in gentle tones she couldn't understand, gesturing toward the waiting ambulance. Her children looked back at her with eyes that asked questions she couldn't answer. Hit like and subscribe to join us for more incredible true stories from history. Comment where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Your support keeps these powerful, often forgotten stories alive for our global community. The corpsman reached for Emil. Katharina had to let go, had to place her burning child on the stretcher, had to watch Hans climb into the vehicle without her. Greta's hand slipped from hers, small fingers losing contact. The ambulance door closed. Through the rear window, three faces pressed against glass. Hans trying to be brave, tears streaming. Greta crying silently, hopelessly. Emil too sick to understand, but searching for her with instinct that knew safety lived in mother's presence. The vehicle pulled away. Dust obscured it within seconds. Katharina stood in the Arizona heat and watched until even the dust settled. She returned to Barracks 7 and stared at 3 empty beds, at toys made from scraps and imagination, at the evidence of existence in space that was suddenly horribly vacant. And in that moment she understood what being a prisoner truly meant. Not the barbed wire, not the guards, but this being powerless to protect your children from regulations that prioritize procedure over a mother's most basic need. 6 months earlier, Katharina had stepped off the ship at Ellis Island with 3 children who had never known peace. She was 32 years old, widowed. Her husband had fallen in North Africa in 1942. She had worked as a supply clerk near Munich, raising her children alone in a country collapsing around them. The regime's propaganda had prepared her for American cruelty, for vengeance, for punishment befitting enemies. Instead, the processing was bureaucratic, thorough, but not cruel. Forms in triplicate, medical examinations, documentation of every detail. Officials who looked tired rather than vengeful. A system designed for efficiency rather than punishment. She didn't know whether this made it better or worse. The trains west carried them through a continent that seemed impossibly vast, through cities that hadn't been bombed, past fields unscarred by warfare. The children pressed their faces against windows, watching this strange enemy country pass by. Hans asked questions constantly. Where were they going? Why were all the buildings standing? When would they go home? Katharina had no good answers. Camp Papago Park sprawled across 700 acres of Sonoran desert. Originally built for Italian POWs, it had been expanded in 1944 to accommodate the growing number of German prisoners. By 1945, it held over 3,000 men in the main compound. In a separate, smaller facility, 47 German women and their children. The women's section was different. Smaller barracks modified to accommodate families. Separate sleeping areas for children. A makeshift schoolroom. A kitchen where women prepared meals using American military rations, supplemented by vegetables they grew themselves. Katharina and her children were assigned to Barracks 7. They shared space with 4 other families. 15 people in a building designed for 8. Privacy was a memory. Personal space was measured in inches. But they had beds. They had food. They had safety from bombing and starvation and chaos. The children adapted faster than Katharina expected. Hans made friends with other German boys, played improvised games in the small yard. Greta helped in the kitchen, learning to make American-style bread that tasted wrong but filled stomachs. Emil, too young to understand imprisonment, simply existed in the moment. Katharina watched them adapt and felt something complicated. Relief that they were surviving. Guilt that they were surviving an enemy captivity. Confusion about what survival meant when your country had lost everything. In July, measles swept through the camp. It started in Barrack 3, spread despite quarantine efforts, moved through the women's section with the inevitability of all contagious disease in close quarters. 17 children fell ill, 3 critically so. Hans was first in their family. Fever, rash, lethargy alarming in a boy who normally vibrated with energy. The camp doctor, Captain Richardson, examined him, prescribed rest and fluids, explained in English Katharina barely understood that Hans would recover but needed careful monitoring. 2 days later, Greta fell ill, then Emil. Within a week, all 3 of Katharina's children were burning with fever, while rash spread across their skin like stigmata. Katharina didn't sleep. She sat beside their beds, placing cool claws on foreheads that were too hot, coaxing them to drink water they didn't want, watching their breathing for signs of complications Richardson had warned about. The camp medical facility was overwhelmed. Richardson and his 2 medical assistants worked around the clock, but resources were limited. This was a prisoner of war camp, not a hospital. Medical supplies were allocated for combat injuries, not childhood diseases sweeping through internment facilities. On August 3rd, Emil's fever spiked to 105 degrees. His breathing became labored, rattling in his chest with a sound Katharina recognized from childhood when her brother had died of pneumonia. She called for Richardson, her broken English barely coherent through panic. Richardson examined Emil, and his expression shifted to something grim. This child needs hospitalization. Real medical facilities, not what we have here. Katharina understood perhaps 1 word in 3, but she understood the tone. Her son was dying. Richardson made a decision. He contacted the camp commander, requested emergency authorization to transport 3 German children to the civilian hospital in Phoenix. Not just Emil, Hans and Greta too, because their conditions could deteriorate rapidly, and separating them would be medically unsound. The request went up the chain of command, to the camp commander, to military government officials, to bureaucrats who had to weigh Geneva Convention obligations against public perception of giving German prisoners access to American civilian medical facilities. Approval came back within 6 hours. Transport authorized. The children would go to Phoenix Memorial Hospital. They would receive care commensurate with their medical needs. And Katharina would not be going with them. The regulations were explicit. German POW mothers could not accompany children to civilian facilities. Security concerns, liability issues, the simple impossibility of guarding prisoners in public hospitals. The children would go with medical escorts. The mother would remain at camp, would receive daily updates, would be reunited with them upon their recovery and return. Richardson explained this through an interpreter. Katharina listened and felt the floor disappear beneath her. She tried to argue, tried to make them understand that Emil was 3 years old and would be terrified, that Hans had nightmares and only calmed when she sang to him, that Greta would be brave and silent and internalize her terror until it manifested as something worse than measles. But regulations were regulations. At 1400 hours on August 4th, the ambulance arrived. Phoenix Memorial Hospital occupied a sprawling complex on the city's northern edge. Built in 1935, it was modern by contemporary standards. Electricity, running water, actual medical equipment beyond what field hospitals could provide. The staff had been notified of the incoming German children. There had been discussion. Some nurses objected to treating enemy nationals when American boys were dying in the Pacific. Others pointed out that children were children regardless of their parents' nationality. Hans, Greta, and Emil were placed in a private room, not out of luxury but practicality. Keeping German patients separate from American patients avoided uncomfortable situations. 2 guards were stationed outside, rotating shifts, present to ensure the children didn't escape, though where 3 sick children would escape to was left unspecified. The head nurse assigned to their care was Mary O'Brien, 53 years old, veteran of 27 years in nursing. She had seen everything from gunshot wounds to infectious disease, had developed the professional detachment necessary to function in medicine. She approached patients as problems to be solved rather than people to be emotionally engaged with. She entered the room expecting to find 3 enemy children who needed clinical treatment. Instead, she found 3 terrified kids burning with fever and crying for their mother in a language O'Brien didn't understand. Hans tried to be brave. At 7, he had internalized that men don't cry, but his face was blotchy with fever and tears he was desperately trying to suppress. Greta had given up on bravery. She sobbed continuously, clutching a cloth doll that was falling apart, calling for her mother in increasingly desperate German. Emil was too sick to be scared. He lay barely conscious, his small chest working too hard for too little air. O'Brien stood in the doorway and felt something crack in her professional armor. These weren't enemy soldiers. These were sick children who had been separated from their mother and deposited in a strange place where nobody spoke their language. She walked to Emil's bed first. Medical triage. Treat the critical case before the stable ones. She placed her hand on his forehead, felt the heat radiating from him, and understood that this child needed immediate intervention, or they would be writing a very different kind of report. The next 48 hours passed in intensive care. Emil received antibiotics, intravenous fluids, constant monitoring. His fever broke on the 2nd day slowly, grudgingly, but definitely breaking. He opened his eyes and looked at O'Brien with confusion, but without fear. Too young to understand nationality. Seeing only someone trying to help, Hans and Greta improved more quickly. Their fevers dropped. Their rashes began fading. Their strength returned in increments. But the psychological distress remained. They spoke to each other in rapid German, their conversations anxious and circular. Where was Mama? When would she come? Why had the Americans taken them away? O'Brien couldn't answer. She didn't speak German, but she understood fear when she saw it, understood particular anguish of children separated from their mother. On the evening of August 6th, O'Brien did something that violated hospital protocol. She sat on the edge of Greta's bed and sang. Not in German, she didn't know German songs, but in English, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her 50 years earlier. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's going to buy you a mockingbird. Greta didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, understood that this strange American nurse was trying to offer comfort. She quieted, listening, and eventually fell asleep, clutching her falling-apart doll. Hans watched this interaction. The next morning he approached O'Brien and said in carefully practiced English, "Thank you." O'Brien felt something inside her shift permanently. That evening, O'Brien found Dr. Harold Chun in his office reviewing charts. She sat down uninvited. "Doctor, we need to talk about the German children." Chun looked up. "Their conditions are improving. Emil should be clear for discharge in 3 days." "That's not what I mean." O'Brien leaned forward. "They're terrified. They're in a strange place with strange people. They don't speak English, and they're asking for their mother constantly. This is causing psychological distress that's inhibiting their recovery." Chun set down his pen. I'm aware. But their mother is a POW. She can't be brought here. Why not? Security concerns, regulations, the usual reasons. O'Brien's voice was steady. Doctor, with all due respect to security concerns and regulations, those children need their mother. Not for some sentimental reason, for legitimate medical reasons. Stress suppresses immune function. They'll recover faster with their mother present. You know this. Chun was quiet for a long moment. Even if I agreed, which I'm not saying I do, getting authorization to bring a German POW to a civilian hospital would require going through multiple levels of command. Then start requesting. Make it a medical recommendation. Document that maternal presence is clinically indicated for optimal patient recovery. Chun studied her. You're putting your neck out pretty far for enemy children. O'Brien met his eyes. They stopped being enemy children the moment they became my patients. Now they're just children, and they need their mother. Chun pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. The formal request moved through channels with surprising speed, perhaps because it was unusual enough to prompt actual decision-making rather than automatic denial. On August 7th, authorization came through. Katharina Weber, German POW, would be transported to Phoenix Memorial Hospital under armed guard to be with her children during their recovery period. At Camp Papago Park, Richardson delivered the news through the interpreter. Katharina didn't understand most of his explanation. She only understood. You will see your children tomorrow. She wept. The other women wept with her. This impossible thing, this mercy she had not expected. This breach in the wall between captor and prisoner. The truck arrived at the camp at 0800 hours on August 8th. Katharina had been awake since before dawn. The drive to Phoenix took 90 minutes. She sat in the back with two guards who didn't speak German, stared out at the Arizona landscape, alien desert dotted with impossible cacti, shimmering with heat that turned distance into liquid. At the hospital, she was processed through security, assigned an identification badge, briefed on rules she barely understood, then led to the third floor, to a private room at the end of the hallway. To a door 2 armed soldiers stood beside. O'Brien was waiting inside. She gestured to the 3 beds where 3 children lay in various states of recovery. Katharina stopped breathing. Hans saw her first. He sat up in bed, his face transforming from sick anxiety to shock to overwhelming relief. Mama, Greta turned at her brother's voice, saw their mother, began crying so hard she couldn't form words. Aimo was asleep, but Katharina moved to his bed first. Maternal triage. Check the youngest, the most vulnerable. She placed her hand on his forehead. The fever was gone. His breathing was easy. He was recovering. Then she gathered Hans and Greta, pulled them against her, held them while they clutched at her clothing and sobbed and spoke in overlapping German, expressing everything they couldn't say in 2 days of separation. O'Brien watched from the doorway, tears running down her own face. The guards watched with expressions that suggested they had not expected their duty to involve witnessing this kind of raw emotional reunion. Katharina stayed with her children constantly for the next 3 days. She slept on a cot beside their beds. She helped O'Brien with their care. She sang them to sleep at night with German lullabies that made American nurses pause outside the door, listening to music in a language they were supposed to hate from a woman they were supposed to see as enemy. Aimo's condition improved dramatically with his mother present. Hans's nightmares stopped. Greta began smiling again tentatively at first, then with something approaching her old personality. The hospital staff noticed. The correlation between maternal presence and patient improvement was impossible to ignore. O'Brien documented it meticulously. Dr. Chun reviewed the data and wrote in his report, "Medical science sometimes requires decisions that transcend standard protocol." On August 12th, Dr. Chun declared the children medically cleared for discharge. Before they left, O'Brien gave Greta a store-bought porcelain doll. Greta stared, confused why an American nurse would give such a gift to a German child. O'Brien knelt and said through the interpreter, "Because you needed something beautiful." Greta hugged the doll, then O'Brien, who hugged her back, this enemy child who reminded her that war made enemies, but children were still just children. At Camp Papago Park, the story spread. The German mother whose children had been taken to an American hospital. The nurse who insisted the mother be brought. The reunion that crossed regulations and nationality. Prisoners repeated it as proof Americans were capable of mercy, contradicting propaganda. American guards saw it as evidence humanity could be maintained, that regulations existed to serve people. In September, Katharina received a letter from O'Brien, translated and censored through official channels. "Dear Mrs. Weber, I hope this finds you and your children in good health. Caring for Hans, Greta, and Emil was one of the most meaningful experiences of my career. They reminded me why I became a nurse, to heal and comfort, regardless of circumstances." Katharina kept the letter folded with her few possessions, and wrote back, "Dear Nurse Mary, thank you for seeing my children as children first. You showed me that enemies in war can be friends in humanity. I will tell my children about you for the rest of my life." The letters crossed military postal systems, two enemy women writing about children, healing and seeing each other as human. Repatriation began in November 1945. Before departure, Katharina received a package. For Hans, an American baseball glove and ball. So you can play American games and remember that countries can be enemies, but children should always play. For Greta, colorful ribbons. For a little girl brave when being brave was hard. For Emil, a teddy bear. Remember that love is stronger than regulations. All signed by Mary O'Brien and the staff of Phoenix Memorial Hospital. The children clutched these gifts through the journey home to California, then Germany, then a displaced persons camp, then relatives outside Munich. Amid devastation, they carried evidence that enemies could be kind. O'Brien and Katharina corresponded for 30 years. O'Brien visited Germany in 1965. They talked about that August when humanity prevailed. "You saved my children," Katharina said. O'Brien shook her head. "I only insisted regulations not separate you." They embraced two women once on opposite sides of war, united by a moment when compassion mattered more than rules.